Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee, and in this video we're going to be talking about thinking and problem solving. We are still in Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. We have a few learning targets today. We're going to be able to identify problem solving strategies as well as factors that influence their effectiveness. We're going to be able to list the characteristics of creative thought and creative thinkers, and we're going to be able to identify problem-solving strategies as well as factors that create bias and errors in thinking. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. Okay, so we're starting on this concept of thinking. What is thinking? What does it mean to think? Well, we're going to use this as a working definition. Thinking or cognition refers to a process that involves knowing, understanding, remembering, and communicating. Let's talk about organization and thinking. Kind of the largest category or largest grouping of how we think about organization and thinking is a concept. This is a mental grouping of similar objects, events, ideas, or people. There are a variety of chairs, but their common features define the concept of chair. And then we get a little bit more specific and we talk about schemas. This is the list of features of a concept, the characteristics that make the item what it is. So, for example, a chair is going to have some type of a seat, some type of a back, and some type of legs or a base. And then we have the most specific organization of thinking, and that is a prototype. This is the typical or best example of the concept that demonstrates the schema. This is going to be what you pull up in your memory when you are asked to consider what is a chair. So you have an idea of what that thing looks like, and that is a prototype. Another example would be the concept of police officer. Your schema involves the characteristics of a police officer. And then the prototype is going to be your best example or the mental representation of what a police officer actually is. So here's an example of that. Does your prototype match this female officer? Probably not. Sometimes our concepts can hinder our problem solving when we make judgments about others or situations. And that's going to introduce our idea of bias. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about problem solving. There are three ways to solve problems. First, you have algorithms. Algorithms are methodical, logical rules or procedures that guarantee solving a particular problem. You try everything. Algorithms exhaust all possibilities before arriving at a solution. They do take a long time. Computers use algorithms. So let's say you want to find oatmeal at the grocery store. Using an algorithm, you would search every aisle until you found the oatmeal. Heuristics are simple thinking strategies that often allow us to make judgments and solve problems more efficiently. They enhance the likelihood of success, but unlike algorithms, they can't assure it. It is speedier, but it has more errors than algorithms. So your oatmeal example would be in finding the oatmeal, using a heuristic, you would read the signs at the end of the aisles and look for cereal, and then you're going to look in that aisle first. Two kinds of heuristics have been identified by cognitive psychologists. You have representative and availability heuristics. While heuristics often help us solve problems, they can also bias our judgment. First, there's representative heuristics, and this is judging the likelihood of things or objects in terms of how well they seem to represent or match a particular prototype. It allows people to make quick judgments. So if you were to meet a man dressed in dress slacks and a sweater who is small in stature, wears glasses, is soft-spoken and somewhat shy, and were then asked if this man were a librarian or construction worker, what would you say? You're probably going to answer a librarian because this image fits your prototype. It is more representative of what your prototype is of a librarian versus a construction worker. Availability heuristics are cognitive shortcuts in which the probability of an event is determined by how easily the event can be brought to mind, and you choose the alternative that is most mentally available. So an example of this is that people are usually more afraid of dying in a plane crash than in an auto accident, despite contrary evidence. Actually, when it comes down to it, statistically, you're safer flying in an airplane. The reason is that plane crashes receive much more publicity, so they're more readily brought to mind. And the last way to solve problems is through insight. Insight involves novel realization of a solution to a problem. It is an aha moment. And this is based on prior experience and initial trial and error to gain the insight. What's really interesting is that brain imaging and EEG studies suggest that when an insight strikes, your aha experience, it activates the right temporal cortex. The time between not knowing the solution and knowing is 0.3 seconds. So let's talk about obstacles to problem solving. Sometimes our thinking can get in the way of solving problems. One of those types of obstacles to problem solving is known as fixation. This is the inability to see a problem from a fresh perspective. It's an impediment to problem solving. There are two types. You have a mental set fixation. This is a tendency for old patterns of problem solving to persist, and it basically makes it impossible for us to see new ways to solve the problem. And we have functional fixedness. This is the tendency to think of only the familiar or typical functions for objects. Another way our thinking can hinder problem solving is with bias. And there are a couple of types of bias you need to be familiar with. There's confirmation bias. This is the tendency to search for information that confirms a personal bias. So you're basically supporting what you already believe. We seek evidence to support ideas and tend to dismiss evidence that is contrary to our way of thinking. Sometimes we consciously seek this evidence, other times it's subconscious. So an example of that would be you believe your boyfriend is faithful, so rather than noticing that he's often receiving text messages from other girls and isn't as available for dates as he once was, you pay attention to the fact that he calls you once a day, even if it's only for a few minutes, and always brings you flowers when he is able to take you out on a date. So you are accepting the good stuff to support what you already believe. Other examples of bias hindering problem solving is a belief bias. This is the tendency for one's pre-existing beliefs to distort logical reasoning, sometimes by making invalid conclusions. So if you believe based on your experience when you were sick as a child that Vicks Vapor Rub has healing qualities to your stuffy nose, then when you observe someone else's use of the rub, say in research, you are likely to interpret the data in favor of its healing powers. Or if you believe that a certain way of taking notes, like Cornell, is the best way to learn, you may discount someone's knowledge when they haven't taken notes the same way you have, or make the illogical conclusion that their learning isn't as solid as yours. And then we have belief perseverance. This is our tendency to cling to our beliefs even if it's in the face of contrary evidence. So an example would be the belief with body image. Your friend believes she's fat. No matter how much weight she loses or how many dress sizes she's down, she still sees herself as fat. Or you believe you are a great friend. No matter how many friends you lose due to your arrogance or lack of compassion and empathy, you still believe you are rock solid at this friendship thing. So how are these different? In confirmation bias, you are seeking evidence and you only see evidence that supports your bias. You either consciously ignore or you don't see the contradicting evidence. With belief bias, your belief alters the way you make conclusions, either accepting illogical conclusions because it matches your belief or rejecting logical conclusions because it contradicts your belief. And belief perseverance. This is when contradicting evidence is obvious and you even acknowledge it, but you still stick to your original belief. There are some other obstacles to problem solving. One is overconfidence. This is the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of one's beliefs and judgments. While it poses some problems for making decisions, it's actually associated with happiness and making tough decisions easier, as thinking everything will work out in the end can keep us from worrying. Think about the last time you made a goal. You said you would complete it by a certain date. How long did it actually take you? So think of a recent school project maybe. You may have experienced some overconfidence in your estimates of how long it would actually take you. Another obstacle to problem solving is exaggerated fear. And this is kind of opposite to overconfidence. This is our tendency for exaggerated fear about how things may happen. Such fears may be ill-founded. Think of our responses after major tragedies like air travel after 9/11 declined due to fear, even though during that period it was probably the safest time to fly ever. How we frame decisions can also make a difference. Framing is how an issue is presented, and it can significantly affect your decision making and judgment. Presenting or framing the exact same issue in two different ways can produce two very different results. The more positive you make it sound, the more people are going to respond positively to it. So, for example, what's the best way to market ground beef? As 25% fat or 75% lean? What about a surgery? 90% success sounds a lot better than 10% failure, even though it's exactly the same statistic. You may be asking yourself, well, how is framing different from priming? Priming is something that we talked about in a previous video. Framing is how you present the information or ask the question itself to alter responses. Priming is presenting a stimulus that alters the way you respond to the information or question that comes after that stimulus. So they're similar-ish, but not quite the same. And that is it for thinking and problem solving. In our next video, we're going to be talking about language and language acquisition. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.